Today, we're talking about representational literature, picture books for deaf and hard of hearing children. And we'll just get right into it. So this is me. This is a little bit about me. I have I use she, her pronouns. My sign name is Maddie like this. I've had my head shaved half like this for about 6 years. I have a Bachelor of Arts in English Literature from Oberlin College, and then a Master's in Deaf Studies Early Language Advocacy from Gallaudet University. I've worked in a variety of deaf educator roles at a cluster program in the northwest suburb of Chicago. So I've been a substitute teacher and a paraprofessional. I worked their summer school ESY program for 5 or 6 years. I worked with a variety of age groups, but most recently I was a one-on-one in a preschool classroom. This was my student. I worked with him for about 1.5 years. It was amazing while I was getting my master's degree. Yeah, so that was us on Twin Day. Pretty cute stuff. Now I work as the Youth and Family Connections Coordinator with CHS. That's the Chicago Hearing Society, which despite the name, services deaf, blind, and hard of hearing folks in the whole state of Illinois. I run their youth program. So we have a deaf mentor program. We do family sign language classes, adult role models and education of the deaf, or ARMED program, where we bring deaf adults into schools. We do literacy programs, family events, just a variety of supports and resource connections for deaf, blind, and hard of hearing kids in Illinois. I'm hearing. I've been involved in the deaf community for 10 to 12 years. I'm a fluent signer and I'm disabled. My disclosures are I'm being paid by Language First to do this presentation, and also I'm a full-time employee of Chicago Hearing Society. I'm going to go ahead and use the term deaf as an umbrella term to encompass deaf, blind, hard of hearing, deaf disabled, or deaf plus individuals. So my usage of deaf doesn't necessitate the use of ASL or the involvement in deaf culture. It's just indicative of a group in a community, and that's how I'm going to use it today. All right. Here's our agenda for today. It's kind of split up into 2 parts, which combine 2 different presentations that I've given before in various conferences or events. We're going to talk about representative literature, and then we're going to talk about how to use that literature, how to read out loud, or in sign, how to read with deaf, blind, and hard of hearing kids. That's called story sharing. So we'll kind of split that up, and we'll do both of those things. And I'll take questions in the middle and then again at the end. So part 1, we're going to analyze the ideologies that exist in literature to which we currently have access. And I'll caveat that to say that for this project, let me back up a second. The representational literature project was my thesis project as a grad student at Gallaudet University. So my goal was to identify what ideologies we are seeing in our current literature that has deaf characters in it, and what's in there now, why it's important, and then what gaps exist. And I wanted to create a resource for librarians and teachers and families and professionals that was a list of possible positive representational literature options, picture books for deaf kids, so that they had somewhere to start. Like, oh, we want to introduce these concepts. We want to introduce positive representation to our kids through literature. Where do we go? So I've created a kind of a graphic that'll be available to you, and we'll talk about it later. But that was kind of the end goal of my project. So I started with about 150 picture books that had deaf characters in it. I took out books where the audience was for hearing kids. So like, oh, can you imagine what it would be like to be deaf? We took those out. That's not really the goal here. I took out ones that had really negative representation, where kids were like severely bullied or othered for being deaf. And I ended up with 24 titles that we're going to talk about today, and I separated them into 5 categories, which we will also talk about. And also if I couldn't find it, like if it wasn't accessible, like if it wasn't available at libraries or on, online or in booksellers and stuff, then I took that out too, because some of these books are independently published, but it's not really effective as representational literature if nobody has access to it. So I took those out too. Yeah, so we'll talk about those gaps and weaknesses, and then what we do about them. What do we do about the books that we don't see in our classrooms or with our families? And then we will kind of pivot into part 2, where we'll talk about story sharing, how to sit, how to read, how to reread, and then we'll circle back around and put it all together with what we read. One second here. Okay. Great. So why does representation matter? Hopefully this won't be mind-blowing to you, but like representation is very important. Kids need to see themselves represented in the media that they consume. It supports the development of identity, confidence, self-esteem, community, and it's especially vital for oppressed groups. Identity politics is more kind of in our cultural consciousness now than it was several years ago, and it's allowing us to, bring up this concept more about the importance of seeing yourself in literature. The same thing applies to disabled kids and to deaf kids. They need to see themselves as lead or background characters and be able to say like, oh, that person is like me, that person is deaf, I'm deaf, same, that concept. See that they have a place in society, that they're valued, and that they can be successful. If kids don't see themselves in their stories, they get the impression that they aren't important enough or valued enough to be included, which can have a lot of negative impacts. So let's take a look at these quotes real quick. The first one says, "The type of literature to which children are exposed is likely to influence their general perceptions of social life." So who belongs in society? Who's the in group or the out group? What kinds of jobs and roles in the community can they have? Do they feel like they belong? All those things come across in literature. The second quote says, "Children's picture books as one agent of socialization are excellent," misspelling, "opportunities to enculturate young children with open attitudes and values." We have the chance to use literacy, something that we're teaching our kids every day anyway, to help them understand themselves and the world around them. So let's, not waste that opportunity. Research indicates that children start to discriminate based on race, ethnicity, disability, gender by the ages of 4 or 5, which is really early. That means that the early exposure that we give them through picture books, as well as other media sources, has a big impact on their development of bias and their attitudes. So we need to be careful with what we show them, even at those early ages, so they understand that they're important. That's true for hearing peers who can learn from those opportunities that, normalizing disabled bodies and disabled people, and incorporating deaf characters seamlessly into stories as part of society. It contributes to a healthy development of empathy and understanding. And also, obviously, the benefit is huge for deaf children themselves, who see themselves as valued and interesting and important. This image here is from a book called Max the Champion by Alexander Strick and Sean Stockdale, which does a great job of presenting disabled characters as prevalent, equal, and valued members of society. When we have books like this, we can start conversations with our kids about people who look different from them, who have different abilities from them. We can normalize that before they have the chance to be afraid or anxious about it if they meet someone in person. So you could be like, oh, this person has an oxygen tube in their nose, and you can talk about that with your kid. This person uses an electric wheelchair. Like, what do we know about that now? And you can discuss that with your kids so that they have that knowledge when they go into society and they aren't afraid of seeing disabled bodies. And it's something new and different. So our methodology for this project that I put together, For each book, as I said, I ended up with 150 that I narrowed down to 24, but I tried to answer the following 6 core questions of analysis. I drew these questions from research about ideology, identity in children's literature, and overall disability representation. So the questions are the accuracy of the deaf representation. So how well do the books reflect real lived experiences of deaf people? So there are many different ways to be deaf, many different deaf experiences. So accuracy doesn't mean that these all follow a specific narrative. It's just, does this represent something that is part of deaf experience? The model presented, so does it adhere to a medical or social model of disability? In other words, is the book encouraging that deafness be fixed or that it be celebrated? The third is identity. Does the text attempt to establish a form of deaf identity for its characters? So does it explain or demonstrate aspects of deaf identity or deaf community? The fourth is diversity. Are the characters represented in the text and the illustrations diverse? Do they represent minority groups in terms of ability status, gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, all of those things? The next is signing. Does the text show or discuss sign language in any capacity? And then authorship. Is the author and or illustrator deaf? Do they have connections to the deaf community? If so, what are they? I want to keep in mind that these don't have like a good answer and a bad answer. It isn't like this book doesn't show ASL, so it's, a bad book. That's not at all what we're looking at here. We're just trying to see those trends, especially as I break these into categories. Like this category has more diversity, but fewer deaf authors, or this book has a lot of medical model and therefore, also doesn't have a lot of ASL. Like what can we notice about the ideology in the books? But that doesn't mean that, there's a good answer and a bad answer for these kind of questions we're looking at. Okay. So our categories here are deaf life, hearing technology, educational, inspirational, and storybook. We'll kind of talk about those specifically. And I use those questions that we just saw to analyze these picture books that were split into these categories by me. And that's helpful in a couple of ways. One, it shows us what books are out there, what are there, what are our options? And it also tells us what kinds of books have deaf representation at all. And it shows us what ideologies look like in each specific category. Like I just said, it kind of gives us idea, kind of trends of what those look like depending on these categories I've separated. How does one category differ from another in terms of authorship, signing, identity, that kind of stuff? All right, so let's get into it. Okay, our first category is deaf life. I've included these charts because I used them for my project. It's not necessary that you memorize them, read them all right now. But you'll have access to this presentation. So if you're interested, this just shows each book that I used in the category, and then answers those questions. So you can kind of take a look at those later. Okay, so the books in the deaf life category portray the experiences of a deaf protagonist as they go about their day. So sometimes deafness is part of the plot, and sometimes it's not. It's just in the background. So The Elephant in the Room is a story of a teenager with hearing aids, and he struggles to hear and understand his family, and those struggles are represented by a toy elephant that belongs to his sister, who kind of says out loud what he's thinking. So it will say, look at me when you talk, or I can't hear you over the crunching of the cereal, or the TV is on in the background. It kind of represents those feelings that he's experiencing through this elephant. Eventually he tells his family that he's struggling and is frustrated, and they agree to be more conscientious about how they communicate, and to make a better effort to connect with him on a way that is not as exhausting for him. Duke the Deaf Dog, this is our next one, is a series of books. Right now there are 4. The first is called Farts Make Noise, which is very popular with kids. It's about the unintentional noises that Duke makes without realizing. They're pointed out like kindly to him as learning experiences. He's not like scolded or yelled at for making noise. The second book is Nevermind, which is about the isolation of being told, never mind, it's not important when you don't understand or hear something. The third one is My Dog, Koa, DAWG, which is about the similarities and differences between Duke and his friend Koa. Duke's family is hearing and Koa's family is deaf. So he's from a generational deaf family. So it points out those differences, how it's fun to play together. And also like Koa has a flashing doorbell in his house. Duke's family uses the sound on the TV as well as the captions. Just some of those differences as they're, friends with similar but also different experiences. The last one, the most recent, is called Sometimes I Like the Quiet, and it's about listening fatigue and how sometimes Duke needs to take his hearing aids off and take a break. The Duke books show pictures of ASL signs throughout the book. So it'll be like an image of, a real person next to the illustrations of them doing the sign. It also has sections in the back written by deaf adults about deaf culture and experiences that's related to the topic. And there are access to recordings of the books being signed and examples of those signs and like a QR code type thing with purchase of the book, which is awesome. The next one is called I Am Amazingly Unique, which is about Morgan. She's a young deaf girl. She wears sparkly pink hearing aids. She talks about how even though there are similarities and differences between her and her peers, everyone is unique and everyone is special. She goes to a hearing school. She uses an educational interpreter, and she's teaching her friends to sign and also tips to help her understand them. ASL is clearly shown as core to Morgan's identity and part of what makes her, amazingly unique. The next one is Mighty Mila. She has bilateral cochlear implants and she wants to be more independent. She feels like her parents still treat her as a kid and she wants to do more things on her own. So she decides that for a whole day, she's not going to ask for help with anything. So, it's fun. She, makes a big mess, spills all the cereal from the pantry. But she realizes along the way that it's okay to ask for help and it's a sign of strength to request support when you need it. The next is Moses. So Moses is a series of books. I think there are 5. He's a deaf boy. He attends a deaf school, like a day school program. He signs with his family and his classmates. His teachers are deaf and they sign as well. And the books show different experiences. He goes to the circus with his family. He goes on a field trip to a concert with a deaf percussionist. He sees a play by deaf performers. All sorts of different kind of experiences. The last in this category is called My Monster Truck Goes Everywhere With Me, which is about a young boy whose favorite toy is this purple monster truck. He brings it everywhere and then he leaves it at his grandma's house and she finds it and brings it back. The book features ASL illustrations of the characters throughout the stories. It'll have like a bolded word and then it will show the character, in an illustrated form, signing the bolded word. So ASL is hard to represent in two-dimensional images because of all the movement and the visual aspects. But it's neat to see signing depicted normally in the story. Interestingly, despite the signing in the pictures, there's no mention of deafness or ASL in the text itself. Even though all the characters sign. So that's kind of an interesting thing that, again, normalizes that ASL, even though they're not really talking about deafness. These stories are engaging and they feature a protagonist overcoming some obstacle or challenge without those challenges ever being deafness itself. So the characters are deaf without being reduced to their deafness, but deafness is still core to who they are and to their identity. And core to their personhood. In these books, we see various school placements, residential schools, hearing schools, mainstream schools, all those different things. We see FM systems, those microphones, we see interpreters, we see ASL, listening fatigue, all of these things that are important and recognizable to deaf life. Mighty Mila, for example, she struggles to put her bike helmet over her implants. So that's a lived experience, a relatable experience for our kids without showing those experiences as negative or reflections on them or making them less at all. Additionally, several of these books have illustrations of hearing tech, implants or hearing aids as being colorful, shiny, pink, that kind of accessorize and show that hearing technology as well as deafness are not shameful, that need to be hidden, but they're areas of pride and can be used for identity building. What this category lacks are deaf authors, which unfortunately is a theme for every category, as well as communities where deaf children can interact with one another. The Moses series is an exception because he goes to a deaf school program and he has deaf peers, but for the other texts in this category, deaf children don't really get to interact with other deaf children at all. They don't have access to one another, despite this being important to community building and combating isolation. Similarly, these characters don't have access to deaf adults. Again, Moses is the exception, but deaf adults are hugely important for deaf kids to see role models as purveyors of language and culture, and also to show that they can become successful adults one day in the future. That's, unfortunately common for a lot of kids in our, American society right now, is that sometimes they don't have access to other deaf kids. They don't have access to deaf adults, but that's, all the more reason to show it kind of represented in literature of like, there is community out there for you. There is identity development possible, even if you don't have it right now. I wanted to highlight another quick strength of this category, which is the inclusion of resources to help families learn ASL and demonstrate the value of the language, especially when paired with deaf cultural perspectives, like at the end of the Duke the Deaf Dog series, with those cultural kind of knowledge base. It's just great to include those resources for families. So a couple examples. I just wanted to show you an image of, this is My Monster Truck Goes Everywhere with Me. So as I said, it kind of shows the signs in the illustration. So my truck is fast. He's fast like lightning, and it bolds the word fast, and then it shows the boy signing fast. This is from Duke the Deaf Dog, and it's about this is the Nevermind book, which is about the phrase nevermind and how it can feel isolating for deaf kids. Duke is upset because his friends and his teachers say, you didn't hear it, never mind, it's not important, or like, I'll tell you later. And that makes him sad and upset that he's being left out of those conversations. So his mom has a rule that in their home, they never use nevermind. Nevermind is not allowed, so that he's always included. And that shows that Duke himself is not the problem. The problem is this like never minding that other people are doing, but Duke himself and his deafness are not the problem. They're not the barrier. It's the people around him who aren't being considerate. All right. Our second category is hearing technology. The books in this section follow the same narrative. There's the same narrative pattern, and there were way more books in this category to narrow down than any other. The story goes like this. A character is struggling to hear or understand. They go to an audiologist, they get hearing aids or implants. The problem is resolved, and they're able to hear and communicate much better. The imbalance of this particular narrative over any other related to deafness is disheartening. We should have a range of stories for deaf individuals and representational literature, not just this resolution of deafness through hearing technology. That being said, these experiences are very common for deaf kids, and having books that share that experience and portray them as normal and understandable can reduce a lot of anxieties surrounding that, and can still be very, positive representational text. If you have a kid who's never been to an audiologist, having a book that talks about that experience, or a kid who's getting implants and talks about that experience, that can be very positive and beneficial. And these are common experiences. So to be like, oh yeah, me too, that's relatable, is valuable. Even though the overwhelming majority of our representational literature being this kind of narrative may not be the best. Okay, so the first one is called Ada and the Helpers. It's about a young fox who uses hearing aids that she calls helpers. She loves dancing. She wants to dance in the talent show. So she heads off into the woods to go to the talent show. And along the way, she meets a bunch of different animals. Each of them is having some kind of struggle. And so she uses her perspective as a deaf dancer to help them with accommodating their abilities and allowing them to do the things that they want to do, just maybe doing it a little bit of a different way. She and her new animal friends make it to the talent show, and they perform a break dance there, and it's very successful. And that's kind of the narrative of that one. The next one is Can Bears Ski? This book is about a young bear who's having trouble understanding their father, and their teacher and their friends. Everyone keeps asking them, do bears ski? And they don't really understand why they would be asked that. They don't really know how to answer. They're very confused. Eventually, they go to the audiologist and are fitted with hearing aids. After that, they realize that everyone was asking, can you hear me? Instead of can bears ski? And they're like, oh, okay. And their listening skills, they work on that. They go to listening therapy, and their skills improve, and they do speech therapy and stuff. Cosmo gets an ear. I'll show you an example in a minute, but this picture book has more words than some of the other ones do, and it uses a unique storytelling technique through multiple choice kind of answers. So, for example, it will say, it's written from the perspective of Cosmo's sister, and she'll say, to describe Cosmo, he A, has long dark brown hair that he keeps blowing out of his eyes like he's a choo-choo train. B, is in heaven when he's eating a mayonnaise sandwich or a plate full of peas with a glass of milk and ice cubes. C, has terrible hearing, or D, all of the above. So it's using this kind of playful format to tell a story, make it a little bit more interactive too. Cosmo goes to an audiologist. He gets hearing aids. He's nervous about the process and about how his friends will react. But in the end, his peers think it's very cool, and he ends up being proud of them and excited to be able to hear better. The next one is Elena's Ears, or How I Became the Best Big Sister in the World. This book is told by the perspective of the family dog. Lacey notices that the new baby that the family has isn't responding to her barking or things like dropping in the kitchen and the doorbell. So she starts barking at the baby all the time to kind of show the family that something is wrong. And eventually they get the hint, and they bring Elena to a audiologist, and she gets fitted with hearing aids and begins listening therapy. And Lacey helps out with the listening therapy by continuing to bark and teaching the baby to bark with her. This book also uses Lacey to kind of discuss sibling dynamics of having a new baby in the house, although it doesn't specifically address sibling dynamics of having a deaf baby in the house. The next book, the last book, is Let's Hear It for Almagal. That's a guess on how that's pronounced. But Almagal is a bubbly elementary school-aged girl. She has hearing aids. They're pink. She doesn't sign, but she has a best friend who does sign, who teaches her some. She loves her hearing aids. They're cotton candy pink. Excuse my correction before. But she realizes that there are some sounds that she can't hear. So she goes to the audiologist, and they suggest getting cochlear implants. So she goes through with the surgery, and now she does listening homework and has to learn how to use them, but she can hear things that she couldn't before. So she's excited about that. As you may have guessed from just the category, all of these books follow a medical model of disability where deafness is, a barrier. It creates barriers, and it's resolved through hearing technology. A strength in this category is when playful aspects of hearing tech as deaf experience are included, and we're not just kind of focused so much on the medical. So for example, in Let's Hear It for Almagal, she decides that her dog needs to listen better, so she tries to put her implants on her dog, and then, he runs around and they get lost, and it's a whole thing. Cosmo Gets an Ear, again, is with those multiple choice questions, which make the situation more lighthearted and less intimidating. So let me show you an example of that real quick. This is from Cosmo Gets an Ear. You can see that the answer, the right answer is upside down at the bottom. And it will illustrate one of the fake answers as just something kind of playful and silly. So in this one, he's got a piece of garlic in his ear. And it's just like a playful and interactive way. When I was a kid, we had a book about manners that did a similar idea. And I remember it being the best thing to be like, haha, here's the joke answer. That's the real one. And then my mom would be like, no, that's not it. And that's just like very entertaining for a kid, which makes this a good kind of storytelling technique. Yep. The next thing I want to show you is this. So this is Can Bears Ski again. The book turns what could be a scary and difficult experience of going to the audiologist for the first time and doing those testing, getting technology, it turns it into something more calming, more funny, and kind of more normalizing. So here's the bears skiing down their audiogram, which is just kind of fun and playful, and that playfulness helps both parents and kids be more comfortable with some of those experiences that are new and can be stressful related to hearing technology. Our next category is educational. So this category is trying to teach something connected with deafness, but the topics vary. So deafness itself, kinds of hearing technology, how hearing aids work, ASL, etc. That's kind of what this category is for. The first one is All the Ways I Hear You, which has a hard of hearing boy who introduces the readers to all of his friends. His friends are deaf or involved in the deaf community, and they use diverse equipment and communication methods. So hearing aids, BAHAs, cochlear implants, ASL, picture boards, tablets. He also has a friend who's a coda, whose father is deaf, and she talks about using an FM microphone when they're in crowded or loud places like at a parade, so her father can hear her better. The next one is The Adventures of Billy Baha and her superhero friends. Billy is a young girl with microtia, and she wears Bahas. She goes to school and she shows off all her friends at her deaf program. They each have different powers. So her friend Elise is a wheelchair user whose power is that she's super fast, or her friend Malcolm is autistic and his power is being super smart. Billy's own power is kindness because she knows that everyone has a power and that everyone is special. Like All the Ways I Hear You, Billy Baha is a really diverse text. Students come from different backgrounds, they have different abilities, they're deaf in different ways. Billy is a young Black girl, and so is her teacher. Her teacher is Black as well. And at one point she says that her teacher, quote, wears her hair in an afro like me. I like that. This demonstrates a more complex understanding of the importance of representation for a variety of identity characteristics. Next one is My Life with Deafness, which is like semi-biographical about a young boy from a deaf family. He attends a school for the deaf. He likes football. He uses closed captionings. His family has a flashing light for their doorbell. And he shows off different elements of his life and attention-getting strategies, and how his classroom is in a U shape so everybody can see each other for sightlines. and just kind of talks about his life and his experience. The next is Nita's Day, which has a sequel, Nita's First Signs. I'll show this to you in a minute, but these are board books that walk through part of Nita's daily routines with her parents. So she eats breakfast, she learns manners, she plays at the park. But each page has a pull tab where you pull it open and then you can see an illustration of the ASL sign that kind of connects to that page. It's a helpful learning tool for kids and families to get some of those basic routine-based signs. And it's just very interactive. It was very popular with the preschool that I worked at. It's just kind of a fun text. The last one in this category is called Using Hearing Aids. This is part of a larger series about various disabilities and how to understand them. This one is about how hearing aids work, why you might have them, how to take care of them. And it uses these little hearing aids like character with little face and everything and little ears. And they kind of talk to each other and interact as they help each other out. And it also explains some of that basic science behind listening, which is cool, which is an interesting thing to kind of share with our kids as well. The books in these categories are more diverse than in other categories. They have a good mix of social and medical models of disability. Several of them feature ASL and deaf identities and, deaf culture where deaf kids have access to each other in a community-based setting. All the Ways I Hear You and Billy Baja both do a great job of showing different ways to be deaf and how to have pride in all of those different ways. Showing a range of deaf characters of different cultural backgrounds and abilities, ethnicities, in a way that's really productive. These books are especially successful if they use a narrative structure as a way of teaching something, or if they're interactive as well. So I'll show you. This is Nita's Day. So in this page, she's learning to eat. This again is a board book and it has these tabs on the side. And as you pull that tab for the page, it kind of opens up and then you can see the sign in the middle, signing eat. And there's a different sign on the back matching with the back page. And it's just a good interactive way of showing that. This is from All the Ways I Hear You, which you can see the diversity here of the kids and how they communicate, what tech they have. This book is explicit about celebrating different ways to be deaf. That line at the bottom, it says the best way to hear is the way that works best for you. Explicitly saying like, you do you, like whatever works for you is a good way to be. And, you're still kind of included in our deaf community, which is a really cool kind of message. Great. Our next category is inspirational. So books in this category tell stories of famous deaf people or deaf history. Sharing deaf history, folklore, and stories is a great way to build identity and self-esteem and allow deaf kids to see themselves as part of a larger group and a larger history. They also encourage deaf kids to have high expectations for themselves, which is great. The first one we're going to do is The Fastest Girl on Earth, Meet Kitty O'Neill, Daredevil Driver. This is a biography of Kitty O'Neill, a deaf woman of Cherokee descent who broke a bunch of world records for speed sports, including a woman's land speed record and a special rocket-powered car called the SMI Motivator. So I had never heard of this before. Seems pretty cool. She also worked as a stunt woman for films. Her rocket record was in 1976. And yeah, that's a pretty cool story. The next one is I Am Helen Keller. There's a bunch of books about Helen Keller. This is the one that I selected. It's part of a larger I Am biography series, which talks about Helen's early life, how she became deaf-blind at 19 months old, how she struggled to communicate, and her eventual success with manual sign language, like on her palm, sign on palm, and work with Annie Sullivan. One of the things I liked about this one is that when it talks about Braille and it shows Braille in the book, the Braille is actually raised. Sometimes when you have these books, they're just printed the Braille on flat paper, and that's not helpful at all, and it doesn't really show anyone Doesn't show a deaf blind kid what Braille is, doesn't show a hearing kid what blind is, doesn't show anyone. It's just, flat paper, like, oh, I wonder what that does. So this one actually raises the Braille on the page, which is a step forward. The next one is called My Heart Glow, Alice Cogswell, Thomas Gallaudet, and the Birth of American Sign Language. It tells the story of Thomas Gallaudet, how he met a young deaf girl named Alice Cogswell. He realized that she was very smart, but, was deaf and didn't have a way to communicate. And he wanted to teach her, to have her get a full education, but he didn't know how. So he went to France and kind of observed other deaf education that was happening there. And he brought back Laurent Claire, a deaf man from France, who together with Gallaudet and Alice and other American deaf students kind of created what we know of as ASL and American Deaf Education. Alice writes to him while he's in France, and that's kind of the perspective that we get. So I'll just kind of warn you that some of that is weird. She talks about like, oh, I'm really worried that something's going to happen to him over there. Like, I worry that God is punishing me for my deafness, with deafness for sins or something. So it gets a little weird in the middle. Still a really interesting story and a great part of deaf history, but just, a little bit of a warning that if you're going to read that, you might want to be ready to have some different conversations. The last one in this category is called the William Hoy story. This is about the deaf professional baseball player, William Dummy Hoy. It talks about how he loved to play, but he had trouble getting on a team because he was deaf. Managers tried to underpay him because they thought he wouldn't notice. But he worked hard and he was able to protect his rights and be successful. It's also because of him that umpires use hand signals to indicate plays and outs and everything to this day. So, it's history of baseball. Okay, unfortunately, all of these books that I found are all written by hearing authors. They also sometimes focus on the history or biography of a particular person in such a detailed way that it's hard to connect to the characters or the stories on a more personal level for the reader. Like, for example, like, wow, Kitty O'Neill drove a rocket-powered car. That's so awesome. But where in the story do we see relatable aspects of deaf experience that our deaf readers can point to and connect with? So Kitty doesn't really sign. It doesn't really talk a lot about, her deaf experience, more about her achievements. So, that's a little bit harder to relate to. You kind of have to fill in those gaps yourself as you were reading it. So books in this category also tend to be limited in diversity. So likely in the name of, quote unquote, historical accuracy. So this is I Am Helen Keller, which does a great kind of workaround for this. In parts of the book that show Helen's life and her experience growing up, it's not very diverse, but later, as it shows the impact of her work and her influence, they show this hugely diverse audience of kids and adults who look up to and learn from Helen. I don't know if we have any superhero buffs in the crowd today, but there are a couple like superheroes represented here as well, of people who are like learning from Helen Keller, which is just a cool way of including that diversity in a historical text. All right, I wanted to bring this up because, as I mentioned a little bit ago, representing ASL is tough on a two-dimensional page. It's a very dynamic language. There's movement and facial expression, and it's hard to show palm orientation and those kind of aspects when you're on a page like this. You'll see arrows sometimes, or kind of descriptions trying to explain what the movement looks like, but it can be hard to parse and fully understand. Or to use as a teaching tool because, ASL isn't meant to be printed on a page like this. So this is an example. This is from the William Hoy story. And this is William, he's the guy on the left, and he's talking to a player on a deaf school baseball team who is saying, like, you can't play with us, you're too small, right? And the sign that this guy is doing is like this claw shape. It's like, I have no idea what that is. I have tried everything I could think of. I asked my thesis advisor, my grad cohort, anyone I could find, and nobody knows what this sign is supposed to be. It couldn't be short because the hand shape is super wrong, but maybe that's what they're going for. The elbow angle is wild. So a lot of the times, and this is the case here, these illustrations are done by hearing people, and maybe they're not consulting with anyone in the deaf community. So errors like this in signing show up. So that's just something else to be aware of if you read these books, is that not all the signs may be accurate, and it can be difficult to kind of understand what they're going for here. Great. Our last category is storybook. So these are folk tales or extra creative stories with a fantasy element, and they tend to have a moral to them. So the first one is Boy. Boy is the boy's name, and it's about a dragon fighting with a king and his soldiers. Boy is deaf and he signs with his family, but the villagers don't understand him. And one day he accidentally ends up on the battlefield, and he sits with both sides and uses drawings in the sand to kind of talk to them, and he asks them what they're fighting about. Turns out they don't know, and he helps kind of resolve that conflict. After this, the villagers are really appreciative, and they learn to communicate with Boy because they value him for who he is now. The thing that I don't like about Boy is that his name is Boy, and that it kind of, I don't know, in some way implies that he can't have or doesn't understand the concept of having like a name. So that's something that I don't quite like, but other than that, it's a really cute story. The second one is Dachi's Deaf, which is about a deaf pterodactyl. It's part of a series of books about dinosaurs with different disabilities. So he wears hearing aids, and sometimes when too many of his friends are talking at once, or it gets too loud, he gets listening fatigue and he isn't able to kind of understand them. So he turns off his hearing aids and takes a break. So one day while he's doing this, he falls asleep on kind of a log, and then the log starts floating down the river towards like a waterfall. And his friends notice, and they try to get his attention, but he can't hear them. So they have to, poke him with a stick and wake him up just in time. And they do, and it's fine. And then they have a conversation about it. And they agree to be more careful about not having all that crosstalk so he can understand them. And also he says that he'll let somebody know if he's on a listening break. So in case of emergency, somebody knows what's up. The next one is called Moonbird, which is about a prince called Orla. When Orla was born, a bubble blown by the moon child burst near his ears, causing him to be deaf. His parents tried to send him to a bunch of doctors and experts to make him hearing using, fantasy magic and technology and all sorts of stuff, but nothing works. Then when he's 5, he's visited by a moonbird and a gazelle and a silver monkey, and they teach him how to talk with his hands and listen with his eyes. So they teach him to sign. And the king and queen don't want to learn to sign, so it's kind of a conflict. And then the moon child blows a bubble over the whole kingdom, so nobody can hear for a while. And so they learn how important it is to be able to communicate with their son, and they all learn sign language, and that bubble goes away and everyone learns to sign, and they apologize to Orla. The last one in this category is called Renvir Can't Hear, or Cannot Hear, which is about a deaf elephant who feels different and lonely. So he decides to go on a trip to find his hearing. So he's along the way, he meets other animals who can't do something but are really good at something else. So there's a fish who can't swim but is a great dancer. And there's a lion who can't roar but he's super strong. And each of the animals say, and I am just fine. So they'll be like, oh yeah, I can't swim, but I can dance, and I'm just fine. And they're satisfied with themselves regardless of the thing that they can't do. So at the end, Renvir discovers that he's a great singer, and he's not lonely now that he has all these friends. So they all decide to just go home, and that he doesn't need to hear after all. The book ends with the statement, they all felt different yet still the same, which is kind of a nice vibe, I think. While these stories can be really fun, Sometimes the creativity overwhelms the representation. So the story is sometimes too abstract to have tangible representative aspects that readers can connect with. I'll talk a little bit about that in the next with some examples. So Boy is a great example because of something that's being effective, because the story is fantastical. There's dragons and stuff, but it's also relatable. So drawing to or writing in the sand to communicate with somebody with a hearing person is, common experience. Like trying to use alternate communication modes to communicate is something that's part of relatable deaf experience. So that improves the representation from some of the more abstract stories, because there's something you can like really point to as like, oh, this kid is deaf and he does things that I do. So the Moonbird story is a little bit more abstract. The thing about the bubbles and the animals and the moon child is a little bit more difficult to grasp, not only conceptually for a kid, but also in terms of representation. Like, well, I don't think there was a bubble with me. So, how do I connect with that? So there's still aspects there that you can connect with, and it's still fun to have these stories. It just might take a little bit more work. So this is the part of the story where the king and queen bring in a bunch of different doctors and magicians and stuff to try to fix Orla's hearing. So you'll see they use like a megaphone or these big ears or, medicines and stuff, hypnotism. Which, as some of us know, was actually a pretty real part of deaf experience, even fairly recently. There are stories of parents who send their deaf kids like up and down an airplane a bunch, try to get the pressure to pop their ears back into working. So, those things are part of deaf history and deaf experience, and might be part of this a kid's experience too, and they can be used as representation and also a way of teaching that kind of history in a storybook fashion. Okay, so what gaps do we see? The biggest gap, we have a lack of deaf authors. I think in this whole selection, there are only a handful. This isn't because deaf people are less likely to want to share their experiences, but they do have significantly less access to the resources to write, illustrate, and publish a book. Publishers seem to like stories from an outside perspective. They prefer parents or siblings or teachers, and they'll prioritize those voices over those of deaf people themselves. This is something that we have to work on kind of systemically in order to provide authentic narratives by deaf authors to our deaf children. Another gap is deaf cultural stories. So as I mentioned before in the inspirational category, the deaf community has a rich history. We have, cultural stories and folklore and fairy tales and stories that get passed down. We're just not really seeing those in picture books. These are a couple of deaf culture fairy tales or heritage stories, but they're for an older audience. So they aren't picture books. They don't kind of match well with young kids. So that's a real gap here, because that's fun. That's important to kind of share those things with each other, and having those in a picture book format would be amazing for our kids. The third big gap is the lack of depictions of deaf community. So as I mentioned, deaf kids having access to other deaf kids having access to deaf adults. Unfortunately, this is true for many deaf kids in the US right now, but our literature would better support our kids if it portrayed support networks and community for deaf individuals, instead of, kind of being like, yep, you're isolated and so is everybody else. There's more value in kind of showing that there's a community out there. Okay, so what do we do about that? As educators, parents, professionals, how do we kind of fill in these gaps? The first thing we can do is encourage our students to write, and that their narratives are important. Let them tell you stories about what they're doing at home or in their lives. share those experiences with each other, with the world, with their hearing peers. We can bring in deaf adults to meet with students and share their own experiences, teaching them that their stories are valued and encouraging them to have those high expectations for themselves. That's that first image here is from our ARMED program, our Adult Role Models in Education of the Deaf program here in Illinois, where we bring in those deaf adults to meet with kids and kind of talk to them about their experiences, show them that there's a community there and that they're important and that they're valued members of society. That's a hugely important thing for developing confidence and self-esteem and identity. We can also work together to collaborate and let our students interact with one another across schools, showing them that they aren't alone and isolated, especially vital for mainstreamed kids who may be the only deaf kid in their school. It's so important to try to bring them together, let them see each other, let them hang out, and get that exposure to other deaf students or deaf kids. The other thing is to keep reading. As our kids get older and get out of the picture book list, we can keep providing them with books that show diverse deaf experiences. Deaf kids become deaf adults. Let's show them those options, deaf teens, in the middle and everything. In Illinois, we do something called Drop Everything and Read Week, Dear Week, which is like an email blast for a week in December where every day a new email is sent out. It has book recommendations of books with deaf characters for a range of age groups. It also has links to ASL storytelling videos and literacy resources for families and professionals. Our last year's 2022, our newsletters are on our website, and we'll do it again next December, and anyone in any part of the world is welcome to sign up for that and kind of get that those recommendations and kind of talk about that literacy. We also need to be conscious about what resources we're providing to our students. So this is specifically about ASL, where many like alphabet posters, sign examples, videos, storytellings are very, very white and able-bodied. And we need to keep a lookout for what we're showing to our kids and our families and our students, and whether it's diverse and representative. There are many different ways to be deaf, different technology, different ways to communicate. We want to make sure that we're showing our kids that they can be deaf the way that they are. And despite all those differences and specifics of their audiograms, they're deaf and they have a deaf community and a deaf identity of which they can be proud. So just something else to kind of keep in mind. Okay, so this is kind of our halfway point. I want to open it up for if anyone has any questions about kind of the first half. Well, we can answer more questions at the end, so you don't feel like you have to have everything thought of right now. But if anyone has any questions about that first kind of section, feel free to pop in and ask them.
If you all have questions, you can type them in the chat, or if you prefer to sign them, let me know in the chat and then I can spotlight you so that we can see you.
Any questions? Again, I'll share these resources with you, so you'll have my PowerPoint as well as my kind of handout that I'll show you at the end of those books that we just talked about, kind of separated into their categories. You'll have access to those. I'm also working on board books right now about collecting representational board books. So, stay tuned for that. One day I'll have a list of board books as well. Okay, well, if there aren't any questions, then I'll just keep going and you can ask them at the end.
Oh, we have one, Maddie.
Okay.
So this question says, do you have a list of the books that get crossed off of your list? I'd be curious to see which ones didn't make the cut.
That's a good question. I have an Excel spreadsheet where, they're highlighted in different colors based on how bad I think they are. sometimes it was really hard to find copies of these books. So I would like have to, buy them from a secondhand shop. And some of them were so bad that I not only didn't use them, but I threw them away. I didn't want to even give them away to anyone and let them continue to be out there. So I don't have that public anywhere, but if you, were curious, you could always email me and I could share that with you. But yeah, some of them are just are older. They're from a different kind of perspective on deafness, where it's really, really negative. And I don't like it. It doesn't feel productive at all for our kids. Again, some of those were books that were aimed at hearing audiences, like, my brother is deaf or my friend is deaf. Can you imagine what that would be like? Or like, oh, my sister is deaf and nobody likes her and nobody wants to play with her. And then at the end, they learn that like they can learn to play with her. And so that's kind of just like an iffy one. So those are kind of some of the things that get sorted out.
Awesome. We have another question. This says, El Defo and Splish Splash. Were these books also on your list?
Yes, El Defo was for a little bit of an older audience. It's a comic, like a graphic novel, and not quite a picture book. So I didn't include that one. I am not remembering Splish Splash at the moment, but it's probably on there. And sometimes they were good books that I just couldn't keep them all. Like I tried to keep it between 4 and 6 for each category. So if there was something that, this is the same idea as we've had before, I would just kind of pick those sometimes at random just to try to get a good selection. So these aren't the only good books out there, certainly not. And this is a kind of a very specific narrow range, but there's other stuff out there that's great, and we're getting more and more as deafness becomes more accepted in our kind of mainstream media.
She says that for Splish Splash, it is a deaf author as well as a deaf illustrator.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm vaguely remembering it, but I'll have to look it up. I did this during my thesis project, so my time was limited as well. So I'm sure I missed some really good stuff, or if it's recent, it's not on this list, but it's, we can, if you want to, connect with me afterwards and kind of send me your recommendations, we can include those in our Drop Everything and Read Week this year.
Awesome. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions, so we will go ahead. Participants, if you still have questions, you can type them in the chat and we will address them when we end here in a little bit. Oh, here's another one. Sorry. Last one. Are you familiar with Books.com? Books.com animates children's stories.
Yes. So there are a lot of really good, I wouldn't say a lot. There are several really good resources for both animation and signing access to literature. I know that Gallaudet has like a series of apps that will show a book, and then you kind of click on a word and it will show you that sign. It will have the whole story signed, and just a lot of different resources for making those books accessible. And those are really research-based, where they did trials where they kind of tested where the eye gaze goes of kids as they're reading. So there are some really good resources out there for that too, definitely. And those are good things to keep in mind. Just wasn't really in the scope of this project.
Awesome. Will you guys go ahead and write any more questions that you may have in the chat? We'll address them at the end. And I will also create a document and list some of these other books that you guys are mentioning. And I'll send it out to everyone at the end.
That's a great idea. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Right. Well, then we'll go ahead into our second half here, which is about story sharing. So what we're going to talk about here is part of a larger curriculum that we're developing at CHS, of how to help teach early intervention providers how to teach families how to read with their kids. What we found was that when we talked to families, a lot of them were like, No, my EI provider never read with my kid. That wasn't something they ever did. And they certainly didn't teach me how to do it. And so we want to make sure that that's happening, because literacy and reading with a young child is a huge indicator of future development of literacy skills and success academically, and is important to language development as well. So we want to make sure that our deaf kids are still getting access to early reading and to literature. Parents are kind of overwhelmed. They're like, how do I read with my kid if they can't hear me? So we want to answer those questions and help them out, so our kids can still get access to that literature. A lot of this comes from research by David Schlepper. It's from like 1975, 1985. And it was Principles of Reading to Deaf Children. What he did was he worked with a bunch of deaf parents and observed them and how they read with their kids, whether their kids were hearing or deaf, and kind of put those things together into these principles of ways to help deaf kids understand literature, understand reading. So a lot of this comes from that, and trying to think if I have that resource on here or not. I think I do. And if I don't, you can always email me for it. But I know that Gallaudet uses it too on one of their like reading resource lists. They use that for their kind of video guide on reading with deaf kids. So we're just going to go through some of that here together. Okay, so how do you sit? This information applies to reading, whether you're using listening and spoken language, or ASL, or signed English, or cued speech, or a combination of those things. The first thing is, regardless of communication mode, you want to try to keep both yourself and the text visible to the child. If you're signing or cueing, obviously it's important for them to see your hands and to see your facial expressions, but also for listening and spoken language, they're using your face to help determine tone, to pick out words with lip reading that they may not be hearing 100%, and to help them understand what you're saying. So to make those connections between the text and what you're reading or signing out loud to them, having both the text and the reader visible is important. And that can happen in a bunch of different ways. There are hundreds of different ways to maneuver kids around while you're reading, and not all of them do keep the text and your face visible at the same time. So you just gotta kind of see what works for your kid and works with your family. So here are just 4 kind of main ways that I recommend. So 1, you sit across from the child and you prop the book up against your legs or a nearby piece of furniture. So this has the benefit of having the book and the reader within eye gaze at all times. Your kid can be sitting, strapped into a high chair or on the floor, and just, contained or not, so that they're looking at you. This way you can read and sign and point without blocking their vision of the text. The second way is to sit side by side. So babies and toddlers are using their peripheral vision more than we think they are. So if you read or sign or cue with a child next to you, they're going to pick up more on your face and signs than you think they are, even if they're not looking at you. This is also a great way for you to follow their eye gaze and comment on what they're expressing interest in. You've got the book on your lap, you're sitting next to each other, you can really see where your child is looking and comment on those things. The third way is to sit your child on your lap and the book on their lap. This way the child has to do more work to see your face. They have to turn around, but it has the benefit of keeping them physically in the reading space, and it uses like cuddling to make reading seem more enjoyable, and it lets them hold the book themselves and maybe turn the pages, which works on some of those pre-literacy milestones as they demonstrate ownership and independence in that reading process. You can also employ some attention maintenance strategies here, even though they may not see your face. So for listening and spoken language, you can get your mouth like right up next to their better ear. You can kind of talk right into them. For signing, you can use some different strategies of signing on their body rather than yours, which makes the reading more interesting and helps them learn how to form sign. For example, if you were talking about a bear, you wouldn't sign bear behind them. You would go over their body and sign bear on their chest in a way that kind of makes that more interactive and teaches them how the sign is formed. The fourth way is to hold the book up and comment on the pictures and discuss what you see and interact with it, and then put it down when you're actually signing or reading. If we hold the page up, we might talk about like, oh, who do we think this is? Is this Mom? Or like, oh, I see cake. Do you like cake? Or like, oh, let's count these or identify colors. And then when it's time to actually read, you put the book down and actually sign or cue the text. You have it in front of you or next to you. So today is Valentine's Day and Mom is making a big cake after you put the book down. So we'll talk about those reading and rereading strategies as we go that might go along with this particular way of reading, of sitting, I mean. Those are just some examples. All right, so how do we read? Oh yeah, here it is. David Schlepper, here we go. 1985, his principles of reading for deaf children. So these are things that he learned and drew from his study. Describe what's happening. So explain what's going on in the story or in the illustrations without focusing too much on the words, especially the first time that you're reading a text. You just want to get the story across. So you can do a full read through later. Right now, you're just talking about getting that story, good to go, making sure your kid is understanding the concepts in the story or what's happening. Connect the English text to what you're reading. So point to specific words as you say or sign them. Work on identification by pointing to an illustration or word, saying it, signing it, pointing again, making those connections that really connect what's written on the page to a concept that they're hearing or seeing. Have your child repeat after you. You'll be surprised by how quickly they're able to find that word on the page that you've noted before, especially in a book with lots of repetition. This book is, it uses jump a lot, jump. And every time I see jump, I point to it and I spell jump. And then, we do jump and maybe we do the action. And then the next page, the kid is going to be able to point out jump in a way that's going to, shock you. They're picking that up way faster than we kind of think they are. We want to elaborate. Don't be constrained by the text. So use illustrations or themes to add to the story. Elaborate on the text to make sure that the child has the background information that they need. Make what is implied explicit. So, somebody has a Band-Aid and, they're crying and you're like, oh, what do you think happened? Like, oh, are they hurt? Oh, they're frustrated. We really want to emphasize those emotions. We want to talk about things that happened outside of the scope of the text, but that, we're kind of inferencing into it. You want to make those things explicit, explain them to your kid so that they're going to pick up all of those cues that they may not get on their own in that first read through. Oh, she sneezed. I think she is sick. You want to really emphasize those things that may not be actually written down. We want to connect as well what we read to the child's life and experiences. So I see a dog. We have a dog too. This dog is white. What color is our dog? Or, oh, look, he got sunburned. Do you remember when you got sunburned? Your skin turned all red and it hurt to touch it. Was that a good feeling or a bad feeling? So you really want to connect what they're reading to their experiences and helping those make those connections. We want to follow the child's lead. So let them select the book. Let them turn the pages or take turns turning the pages. Let them absorb the pictures and look at it before turning the page. Let them comment on what they're seeing. Use nonverbal cues like watching their eye gaze to judge when to move on. Comment on what they seem to be looking at or focused on. If we're looking at this page on the slide and they're really looking at that watering can and you're tracking their eyes, comment on it. Oh, that's pink. That's a watering can. What is that for? Really comment on the things that are interesting to them. Story sharing should be collaborative. So let the child explore and expand without controlling that interaction. You want to adjust your reading style to fit the story. So be creative with labels and classifiers when reading. Role shift and use facial expressions to embody characters. If you're using LSL, spoken language, you want to change your tone and your voice, maybe like puff yourself up. The same is true for ASL. You want to make that character look different so it's more engaging and interesting. You can role play to extend concepts, having the child follow along with the characters and perform actions as you read. Like, oh, jump, jump. Can you jump too? Or, oh, he gobbled up all the cookies. Those look so good. Can we gobble them up? Like, oh, gobble, gobble, gobble. And just involving your kid in that reading process. The last thing is to expect success. Expect your child to become literate. It makes a difference. Share your own love of books and model reading behaviors to them, and expect them to become successful at it. Here are some attention maintenance strategies. Again, we want to use eye gaze to see what the child is interested in and follow their lead. We want to allow wait time for them to absorb the illustrations. And also when you're asking questions, say, oh, what color is our dog? Give them a couple, beats to think about that and to respond. Wait patiently for them to look up again if they're kind of engrossed in the illustration. Or use their peripheral vision to keep going. Shift the book or lightly tap them to refocus and redraw their attention. Engage them with eye contact and facial expression to kind of hold interest. Role playing and character embodiment really help with that too, as does active participation. And again, utilize that peripheral vision so that you can read, cue, and sign even without their full attention. As we know, if we wait for their full attention, we may never get through a book. So just do your best. They're going to be picking up more with that peripheral vision than we kind of think they are. Here are some specific ASL tips for signing aloud. When signing, you can use ASL variation for repetitive phrases. So variations can be the same sign increased in intensity or can show different meanings of the word. So you might be like, oh, wait, the first time, and then the second time, like, wait, and then increasing that intensity as you keep going. Or you can use different signs. So I have an example here. Oh, here. Okay. So the back of the book, this is Duke the Deaf Dog. This is Nevermind again. The back of the book actually includes an ASL lesson about different ways you can sign the repeated phrase, never mind, to match each context. So, the first time is Duke doesn't hear his friend and he's like, what did you say? And his friend says, never mind. So the book says you could sign, never mind, nothing, I didn't say anything. The next one, the teacher says to line up and Duke didn't hear her. So he says, oh, I didn't know it was time to line up. And she says, never mind. Like, it doesn't matter. Never mind. Duke is on the playground with his brother and they're kind of bullying him a little bit because they're doing like fake sign language. And his brother says, oh, never mind them. They don't know you're cool. Never mind. Like, don't worry. It's fine. Never mind. And then the last one is, with that image we saw before, like his mom has a rule, never say never mind. And that way they spell it, never mind. So, you're kind of encompassing all of those different meanings. So those are just some way you can use like different variations on ASL to make sure that you're contextually accurate, that sign is matching the situation, and also, showing that signs can mean different things. It keeps interest and it's helps them make meaning out of English text. You can also adjust sign style and placement. Like I mentioned before, like when you sign on your body or their body, you can sign on the book itself, you can sign on a stuffed animal or whatever. All sorts of different things to hold interest and variety. You can use personalities to impact sign style or location. You've got Papa Bear might have a big sign style and back shoulders. Mama Bear might be a little bit more like this, and Baby Bear might be really little. And so you're going to adjust those sign styles to match those different characteristics. You can also use role shifting, role playing, and expansion with classifiers monster truck book, you've got your car classifier ready to go, just making that more engaging. We can also incorporate fingerspelling. So research shows that fingerspelling is valuable in the acquisition of literacy skills because it has a direct correspondence with the written word. And children will imitate patterns of fingerspelling very early, and this assists with understanding of how the words are formed. So even though they may not be able to form, kiwi like this, they might do something that looks like vaguely the same shape. And that you're like, oh, I know what that means. And that shows that they're kind of developing and making those connections and those skills. So when you're reading, you can point to a word or image, sign it, spell it, sign it, fingerspell words that don't have signs. Don't be afraid to fingerspell with young kids. Okay, so this is how we reread. Kids love repetition of stories, and that's a huge benefit for literacy development. So we start by explaining the story rather than following the text. That's what we talked about. We're going to make sure they're understanding what's happening in the story before we actually bother to read all the words. Next time that you read it, you can add in a little bit more. Maybe you add in some dialogue or narration. You can ask questions about what's happening. Do they remember what happened from the previous time you read it? Can you connect the book to their real life? Can they perform an action or follow along with you? Expand and elaborate on what isn't there. Add emotions, background, all of those things that we're adding more information this time that we weren't focused on before because we were really interested in getting that story out there. We wanted them to know about, what the three bears are doing. This time, why are they doing it? Maybe, adding in some other pieces like, oh, we said she had a basket and maybe she had cookies for her grandmother. Now maybe, who made those cookies? Where did they come from? We just want to add more things to the story as we're getting those elements, kind of putting them together. So we want to focus on repeated phrases in our rereading now that we have a little bit of experience with it. And we also want to point out specific words, especially those repeated words. And then as we get more familiar with the story, we can read it more as it's written. So these images are from a board book called Baby Loves the Five Senses Hearing, which is a great book. I think it's awesome. It kind of talks about how hearing works and, it's designed for young kids. And it has a section that talks about hearing aids, implants, and also about signing kids that don't hear. And so maybe the first time we read it, we just talk about what we see. We talk about, oh, I see hearing aids. You have hearing aids. Or, oh, she's got bows in her hair. Oh, it's a girl. All sorts of things. Next, you can talk about, oh, how do they hear? Like, oh, this hearing aid. Oh, what is that for? And kind of adding those things in. And then later, as you've read it more and more, you could add in the actual words. Like, oh, a hearing aid can make sounds louder. And actually reading what you're seeing. You can talk about the difference between hearing aids and implants as you actually add in those texts, as you add in those concepts. You can be like, oh, okay, well, what makes it different? And kind of ask those questions as they've got that background and as they're getting more and more each time you read it. So these pages are from Ada and the Helpers. There's a page in between them that's not here, so don't be confused about the story. But okay, so this is first of all, you can see that this book is showing fingerspelling. So when you read it, you can have your kid help you with the fingerspelling and kind of point out those words in a helpful way. And also the first time we might just talk about what we see. I see Ada. I see a mole. I see plants. You can identify things, label things, fingerspell along. And then we want to add in emotions. How do you think she's feeling? How do you, looks sad. Why? And then the second image, like, oh, he looks happy. Talk about those emotions. The next time you read it, you can add in the dialogue. Might be like, oh, that's okay. Maybe you can help me with this or whatever. Add in some dialogue, ask questions about what's happening and what you've read before. And then as you get on and read it again and again, you can actually follow the text. You can go on and actually read, oh, that's okay, the fox replied, and actually get to that word part, whether you're reading with spoken language or signing, actually getting closer to the text. Okay, so we've made it back around. This is what we read. So back to the books. So this is the graphic that I made as part of that earlier thesis project that I wanted to be able to provide to families and teachers and professionals and librarians as something that they could use to kind of get a start on some of those books. Again, not everything out there. And certainly there's a lot of room for growth, and there's a lot of great books that aren't included here. And you might not even agree with all the books that are here, but this is just kind of a starting point. So it's important to see yourself represented in literature, as we've talked about. And there are many other texts that we can find that have deaf, blind, or hard of hearing characters that serve as that positive representation. So they want to show different aspects of experience. We don't want them to pity or look down on deafness, and we want kids to be able to see themselves as worthy of having their stories told. So keep representation in mind when you pick what you're reading with your kids. Here are some board book examples. They don't have a lot of words in them. They don't have a lot of complicated stories. Some of our kids are working with a language delay, so these might be more fitting of our levels. Or just for younger kids. They can still do amazing work in normalizing disability and letting our kids see themselves reflected. So we see, hearing aids on both kids and adults. We see mobility aids, adaptive bicycles. This one has a wheelchair using kid who uses adaptive equipment in the classroom, which is awesome because it gives those exposure to our kids who are reading them. It makes a huge difference. Whether you actually focus on them and talk to your kid about them or not, it's still a huge normalizing influence to have them present as a normal part of that text. Again, let's talk about our ASL resources with our alphabet posters and our sign examples, making sure those are diverse as well. And that your students are being represented. And here's an image from Billy Baha that shows there are many different ways to be deaf. Implants, Bahas, hearing aids, signing, cueing, spoken language, combination of those things. Whatever you're using, showing kids that whatever way they're using, despite all their differences and specifics, again, they're part of this community and their stories are important. I'm going to touch briefly on teaching reading online. So, for parents here, this might not be quite as applicable, but it's helpful to also, just because the main thing about teaching reading online is keeping attention. And parents need that. So for the most part, you're going to employ the same strategies as before. But when working with kids, especially young kids, teaching virtually can be hard with keeping that focus. So the tips that I have are to connect the text to their real world. So this story is about an elephant. Do you have an elephant in your house? Have them find a toy, bring a stuffed animal, bring something tangible. So if you're reading about food, have them get a bowl and spoon from the kitchen and kind of act along with you. Engage the family in meaning making as much as possible. That will, including parents and siblings and caregivers in that reading experience, will help them be better equipped to read when you're not there. And also engage the child more because they're physically in the room. So have them act out part of the book or role play, like, oh, Dad, you be Papa Bear, so you're going to do these parts. Like, what do you say? Yep, bringing something tangible like a toy or something connected to the book, and using interactive texts. So find texts that ask for actions or encourage following along. They hold interest even virtually, and you can continue to use those same strategies, focusing on repeated phrases, exploring the illustration, expanding, etc. An example of that is this is called 1, 2, 3 Jump. As you can see, there's a kid with a cochlear implant. And also the book does a great job of being like, this is jump with me, jump with like all these different animals. This is how a dog jumps or whatever. And then like you can really make that interactive and be like, oh, you jump along. And that can be done virtually with the family's help in a way that really makes the reading experience more engaging, and also still connects to the text. So you'd be like, oh, every time you see jump, you spell jump, you talk about jumping, and then you do the action. Yeah, so you follow along. What do you see? What kind of jump do you think he's doing? And then you actually follow through and do the action. Okay. Language and literacy are tied closely together, and both are huge indications of future success and healthy development. So we need to start working on literacy skills as early as possible and teach families how to continue to work on those literacy skills on their own. Again, we need to expect success. With the right supports, there's no reason a deaf, blind, or hard of hearing child can't become literate. We want to be conscientious and intentional about what we're reading with our kids. Seeing themselves as both normal and as special is so vital to their confidence, self-esteem, and identity development. Our world is so diverse with ability status, race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality. Celebrate those differences and teach your kids how to celebrate them as well using literature. This is from I'm Amazingly Unique, and this isn't the only book that shows this. A couple of the books have toys. The kids have toys that have implants as well. They have hearing aids. They match them. When I was working at a preschool for winter break for the holiday season, I gave each of the kids like a Mickey Mouse doll that had implants or hearing aids that matched theirs. So they were from Etsy and it was cute and the kids loved them. But the important thing there is that you want to show them that they can have pride in those things, pride in who they are. And as something that makes them special and makes them, part of this larger community. Okay. Off my soapbox, this is my contact information. If you have anything you want to share with me, or you want further resources or to be connected, if any of you live in Illinois and you're interested in any of our services for deaf, blind, or hard of hearing folks, feel free to reach out and get in touch at any time. We also have family sign language classes that are free for families with deaf, blind, and hard of hearing kids. And those are online, and you don't need to be a resident of Illinois to take them. So registration is, I think, basically closed now. The classes start next week, but we hold them 4 times a year. So if you are interested yourself, or if you know anyone who might be interested in those classes, you can shoot me an email and I'll add you to our email list. So when those classes become available again, you can register for those. So Illinois residents can take some in-person classes in the Chicagoland area. And if you are not from Illinois, you can still take those family classes online. Those classes are in beginner and beyond beginner level, and they're offered in English and Spanish. And I think that's all I have to say.